Sergeant Viktor Petrov stepped off the military transport plane at RAF Northolt, his chest swelling with pride as he surveyed the British airfield. The crisp London air filled his lungs as he adjusted his pristine Russian Marine uniform, the medals on his chest catching the afternoon sunlight. Viktor had served 12 years in the Russian naval infantry, earning recognition in conflicts across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, and he expected the same level of respect here in Britain. The occasion was a joint military exercise between NATO allies, bringing together elite forces from various nations to train and share tactical knowledge. Viktor had been handpicked to represent the Russian Marines, a selection that had inflated his already considerable ego. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders and a commanding presence, Viktor was accustomed to being the most intimidating person in any room. His fellow Marines back home called him the Bear, not just for his size, but for his fierce temperament and unwillingness to back down from any confrontation. As Viktor made his way through the base, he couldn't help but notice the differences between Russian and British military protocols. The British soldiers seemed less rigid, their interactions more casual than what he was used to. In Viktor's mind, this suggested weakness, a lack of proper military discipline that he found disappointing. He had heard stories about the legendary toughness of British forces, but what he observed seemed to contradict those tales. The briefing room was filled with representatives from 12 different countries, each wearing their national uniforms with pride. Viktor took his seat near the front, his imposing frame making several smaller soldiers unconsciously shift in their chairs. The British colonel conducting the briefing explained the week's schedule, which included training exercises, cultural exchanges, and a ceremonial visit to Buckingham Palace. When the colonel mentioned the palace visit, Viktor's ears perked up with interest. During the break, Viktor struck up conversations with various soldiers, always managing to work his accomplishments into the discussion. He spoke of surviving Arctic training in Siberia, leading successful missions in hostile territories, and earning commendations for valor under fire. The other soldiers listened politely, but Viktor interpreted their politeness as admiration and respect for his superior experience. The American Marines seemed particularly interested in Viktor's stories, asking detailed questions about Russian training methods and equipment. The British soldiers, however, remained more reserved, offering only polite nods and brief responses when Viktor attempted to engage them. This reserved behavior puzzled Viktor, who was accustomed to his reputation, opening doors and commanding immediate respect. That evening, over dinner in the officers' mess, Viktor learned more about the upcoming palace visit. They would be given a guided tour of the staterooms, followed by a ceremony where they would witness the changing of the guard from a privileged position. Most exciting of all, they would have the opportunity to meet some of the Queen's Guard personally, the elite soldiers responsible for protecting the British royal family. Viktor had read about the Queen's Guard during his preparation for this trip, but his research had left him unimpressed. The tall black hats, the red tunics, the seemingly ceremonial nature of their duties, it all struck him as outdated pageantry rather than serious military work. In Viktor's experience, real soldiers wore camouflage and carried modern weapons, not fancy dress uniforms and antique rifles. He wondered how these toy soldiers would perform in actual combat situations. As the week progressed, Viktor participated in various training exercises with mixed results. His physical prowess was undeniable. He excelled in hand-to-hand combat demonstrations and strength competitions. However, his attitude began to grate on some of the other participants. Viktor had a habit of criticizing techniques that differed from Russian methods, often suggesting that his way was superior without considering the merit of alternative approaches. The British soldiers in particular seemed to grow tired of Viktor's constant comparisons and boastful stories. When working with a British paratrooper unit during a tactical exercise, Viktor loudly proclaimed that Russian Spetsnaz would have completed the same mission in half the time with better results. The British soldiers exchanged glances but said nothing, their discipline preventing them from responding to what they clearly considered inappropriate behavior. By midweek, Viktor had developed a reputation among the international group as someone who was skilled but difficult to work with. The American and Canadian soldiers had begun to avoid partnering with him during team exercises, while the Europeans maintained professional courtesy but kept their interactions brief. Only Viktor seemed unaware of the growing tension his behavior was creating. The day before the palace visit, Victor spent hours polishing his uniform and researching British royal protocol. However, his research focused primarily on identifying opportunities to demonstrate his own importance rather than understanding the respect and reverence expected during such occasions. He viewed the upcoming visit as a chance to network with influential people and perhaps share some of his military wisdom with the ceremonial guards. Victor's roommate, a quiet Norwegian special forces operator named Lars, tried to subtly suggest that Victor might want to tone down his approach during the palace visit. Lars had served alongside British forces in Afghanistan and had developed a deep respect for their professionalism and capabilities. He attempted to explain that the Queen's Guard were not just ceremonial figures but highly trained soldiers who took their duties extremely seriously. Victor dismissed Lars's advice with a wave of his hand, confident that his experience and rank would speak for themselves. He had faced down Chechen rebels and survived combat in Syria. Surely he could handle a conversation with some palace guards. Victor went to sleep that night, planning what he would say to demonstrate his superior military knowledge and perhaps offer some constructive criticism about British military traditions. The morning of the palace visit dawned clear and bright, with early autumn sunshine casting long shadows across the London streets. Victor dressed with extra care, ensuring every button was polished and every crease was sharp. He had decided to wear his full complement of medals and decorations, wanting to make sure the British Guards would immediately recognize his superior rank and experience. As the group boarded the bus for Buckingham Palace, Victor positioned himself near the front, where he could have the best view and be among the first to disembark. The other soldiers seemed excited but respectful about the upcoming visit, many of them checking and rechecking their uniforms to ensure they met the strict dress code requirements. Victor noticed their nervousness and felt superior. After all, he had met with high-ranking officials and foreign dignitaries before. The bus wound its way through central London, passing historic landmarks that drew appreciative murmurs from the international group. Victor barely glanced at the sights, instead reviewing his mental notes about British military hierarchy and planning his approach for the encounters ahead. He was particularly interested in meeting the guardsmen, confident that a fellow professional soldier would appreciate his direct, no-nonsense approach to military matters. As Buckingham Palace came into view, even Victor felt a moment of awe at the grandeur of the royal residence. The imposing facade, the ornate gates, and the perfectly manicured grounds spoke to centuries of British power and tradition. However, Victor quickly pushed aside any feelings of intimidation, reminding himself that he was a battle-tested warrior who had earned his place among the world's elite soldiers. The bus pulled through the palace gates, and Victor caught his first glimpse of the Queen's Guard at their posts. Even from a distance, he could see their rigid posture and unwavering focus, but his first impression remained unchanged. They looked like toy soldiers playing dress-up, not serious military personnel. Victor straightened his shoulders and prepared to show these ceremonial guards what a real soldier looked like. The international military delegation was escorted through the grand entrance of Buckingham Palace by a perfectly dressed British officer who moved with the precision of a metronome. Victor studied everything around him with the calculating eye of someone looking for weaknesses, taking note of security positions and guard rotations. The opulent staterooms impressed him despite himself, but he maintained his critical perspective, viewing the grandeur as evidence of British obsession with outdated traditions rather than practical military efficiency. Their guide, Major Harrison, led them through a series of magnificent chambers filled with priceless artwork and historical artifacts. The other soldiers listened attentively as the Major explained the history and significance of various pieces, but Victor found himself growing restless. He had come here to meet real soldiers, not to admire dusty paintings and antique furniture. When would they finally encounter the famous Queen's Guard he had heard so much about? The answer came as they rounded a corner into the Grand Hall, where two guardsmen stood at attention, flanking massive oak doors. Victor's breath caught for a moment as he took in their imposing presence. Both men stood well over 6 feet tall, their bearskin hats adding another foot to their already commanding height. Their red tunics were immaculate, and their posture was so rigid they might have been carved from stone. Most striking of all was their absolute stillness. Not the slightest movement betrayed their humanity. Major Harrison explained that these were members of the Coldstream Guards, one of the oldest and most prestigious regiments in the British Army. He detailed their history, their role in numerous conflicts, and their current responsibilities protecting the royal family. Victor listened with growing skepticism, unable to reconcile the Major's descriptions of battle honors and military excellence with what he saw as elaborate costume drama. The delegation was invited to observe the guards more closely, with strict instructions about maintaining respectful distance and avoiding any attempts to distract the soldiers from their duties. Victor hung back initially, studying the guardsmen with the analytical gaze he usually reserved for potential adversaries. Their weapons, while ceremonially dressed, were clearly functional. Their bearings suggested extensive training, yet something about their stillness struck Victor as artificial. More performance than genuine military readiness. As the group began to move toward another section of the palace, Victor made his decision. He approached the guardsman on the left, a tall soldier with pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Victor positioned himself directly in the guard's line of sight and offered what he considered a respectful military greeting between equals. "Good afternoon, soldier," Victor said in his heavily accented English, his voice carrying the authority he was accustomed to commanding. "I am Sergeant Viktor Petrov, Russian Naval Infantry, 12 years of service, multiple combat deployments. I wanted to meet a fellow professional and perhaps share some experiences." The guardsman's response was absolute silence. Not even the flicker of an eyelid acknowledged Victor's presence. Victor waited a few seconds, assuming the soldier needed time to process the introduction, or perhaps hadn't heard him clearly. When no response came, Victor stepped slightly closer and raised his voice. "I said, good afternoon, soldier. I am Sergeant Petrov. I've served in Chechnya, Syria, and the Arctic. Perhaps you've heard of the Russian Naval Infantry? We are the elite amphibious force of the Russian military." Victor's chest swelled with pride as he recited his credentials, confident that this impressive resume would break through whatever pretense of stoicism the guard was maintaining. Still nothing. The guardsman continued to stare straight ahead, as if Victor didn't exist. Victor felt a flush of irritation creeping up his neck. In his experience, military professionals showed respect to fellow warriors, regardless of nationality. This apparent snub was not only rude but unprofessional by any standard Victor understood. Major Harrison had noticed Victor's unauthorized interaction and was moving in their direction, but Victor was too focused on the unresponsive guard to notice. The other members of the delegation had also begun to take notice, with several soldiers exchanging worried glances. Lars, the Norwegian operator, started moving toward Victor with the clear intention of defusing whatever situation was developing. Victor decided to try a different approach. Perhaps the guard didn't understand English well enough to appreciate the significance of Victor's introduction. He would speak more slowly and clearly, ensuring his message got through. Victor moved another step closer, now well within the guard's personal space, and adopted the tone he typically used when addressing junior soldiers who needed correction. "Listen carefully, soldier. I am attempting to communicate with you as one professional to another. In the Russian military, we show proper respect to visiting officers and senior enlisted personnel. I have achieved the rank of sergeant through 12 years of distinguished service in combat zones. The least you can do is acknowledge my greeting." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Victor had raised his voice enough that his statement carried to the other members of the delegation, several of whom were now watching the scene unfold with obvious concern. The guardsman's continued silence was no longer just rude. It was becoming a matter of Victor's professional reputation and personal honor. Major Harrison reached Victor's position and immediately attempted to intervene. "Sergeant Petrov, if I might have a word with you privately," the major said in the diplomatically firm tone of someone accustomed to managing delicate situations. "There are certain protocols regarding interaction with the Queen's Guard that I should have explained more thoroughly." Victor barely glanced at the major, his attention focused entirely on the stone-faced guard. The soldier's continued refusal to acknowledge him had triggered something deeper than mere irritation. In Victor's world, respect was earned through strength and demonstrated through recognition between warriors. This guard's behavior suggested he didn't consider Victor worthy of basic military courtesy, an insult that Victor couldn't allow to stand unchallenged. "No, Major, this is between soldiers," Victor said, dismissing the British officer with a wave of his hand. He turned back to the guardsman, his voice taking on the edge of authority he had developed during years of commanding men in dangerous situations. "I am speaking to you, soldier. In my country, ignoring a superior's direct communication is grounds for disciplinary action. I suggest you show proper military respect and respond appropriately." The delegation had now completely stopped their tour to watch the unfolding drama. Victor could sense their attention but interpreted it as anticipation that he would successfully assert his authority over this disrespectful subordinate. He had no idea that his behavior was violating centuries of British military tradition and creating a diplomatic incident that could have far-reaching consequences. Victor decided to escalate his approach one final time, drawing on his most authoritative command voice, the one that had compelled immediate obedience from countless Russian Marines. He delivered what he considered his ultimate demonstration of military supremacy. "Soldier, I am ordering you to respond to my greeting. As a senior non-commissioned officer with extensive combat experience, I outrank you in any practical military hierarchy. Your behavior is unprofessional and disrespectful to a visiting military representative. I demand that you acknowledge my position and show appropriate military courtesy immediately." The words echoed through the grand hall with unmistakable authority. Victor had put the full weight of his personality, experience, and military bearing behind the command. In every previous situation throughout his career, such a demonstration of dominance had produced immediate compliance and recognition of his superior status. For a moment, the hall was perfectly silent, except for the distant sounds of London traffic beyond the palace walls. Victor stood confidently, waiting for the inevitable acknowledgement of his authority. Major Harrison looked pale, clearly understanding the severity of what had just occurred. The other delegation members watched with a mixture of fascination and horror, most of them realizing that Victor had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. Then the guardsman moved. It was not the response Victor had expected. Without breaking his forward gaze or changing his expression in the slightest, the guard's right hand moved with mechanical precision to the bolt of his rifle. The metallic click of the weapon being readied echoed through the hall like a gunshot, sharp and unmistakably threatening. The movement was so fluid and controlled that it seemed almost choreographed, yet the menace it conveyed was absolutely real. Victor's confidence evaporated instantly. The casual ease with which the guard had demonstrated his readiness to use force was unlike anything in Victor's extensive military experience. This was not the response of an ornamental soldier or ceremonial figure. This was the controlled, professional reaction of someone prepared to eliminate a perceived threat without hesitation or emotion. Major Harrison stepped forward immediately, his voice cutting through the tension with crisp authority. "Sergeant Petrov, step back from the guard immediately. That is a direct order from a superior officer." The major's tone brooked no argument, and for the first time since arriving in Britain, Victor found himself automatically complying with someone else's command. As Victor stepped backward, his mind raced to process what had just occurred. The guard's response had been so swift and decisive that Victor realized he had fundamentally misunderstood the situation from the beginning. These were not ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up. They were elite warriors operating under protocols that Victor had never encountered and couldn't begin to comprehend. The guardsman smoothly returned his weapon to its previous position, the entire sequence having taken less than 3 seconds. His expression never changed, his gaze never wavered, and his breathing never quickened. It was as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a minor adjustment to his equipment, barely worthy of notice. Victor found himself backing away further, suddenly aware that every member of the delegation was staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment. The Norwegian operator Lars was shaking his head slowly, his disappointment clearly visible. Even the Americans, who had initially seemed impressed by Victor's stories, were now looking at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Major Harrison guided Victor away from the guards with the firm but diplomatic touch of someone accustomed to managing international incidents. The rest of the delegation followed at a respectful distance, their excited chatter about the palace tour replaced by uncomfortable whispers about what they had just witnessed. Victor walked in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process how quickly his attempt to assert dominance had transformed into a humiliating demonstration of his own ignorance. In a private anteroom away from the other visitors, Major Harrison closed the door and turned to face Victor with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with barely contained frustration. The British officer had spent years managing diplomatic exchanges between military forces, but rarely had he encountered such a spectacular breach of protocol from someone who should have known better. "Sergeant Petrov," Major Harrison began, his voice maintaining the measured tone of someone choosing his words very carefully. "I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding about the nature and role of the Queen's Guard. What you just experienced was not disrespect or unprofessionalism. It was the absolute pinnacle of military discipline and protocol." Victor wanted to respond, to defend his actions and explain his perspective, but found himself uncharacteristically speechless. The Guard's lightning-fast response to his commands had shattered his assumptions about British military capabilities and left him questioning everything he thought he understood about professional soldiering. Major Harrison continued his explanation with the patience of an educator addressing a particularly difficult student. "The Queen's Guard operates under the oldest and strictest military protocols in the world. When on duty, they are not permitted to speak, move, or acknowledge anyone except in response to direct threats or specific ceremonial commands from authorized personnel. Their silence is not rudeness. It is the highest form of military discipline imaginable." The words hit Victor like physical blows. Every assumption he had made about the Guards being ceremonial figures crumbled as Major Harrison explained their selection process and training requirements. These soldiers were chosen from the most elite regiments in the British Army, each one having proven themselves through grueling selection procedures and extensive combat experience. Many had served multiple tours in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflict zones before earning the privilege of protecting the royal family. "The soldier you attempted to command," Major Harrison continued, "is Lance Corporal Williams of the Coldstream Guards. He completed 3 tours in Helmand Province, earning a military cross for valor in combat. He has undergone specialized protection training that makes him one of the most lethal soldiers in the British Armed Forces. His apparent stillness masks a level of situational awareness and readiness that few military personnel anywhere in the world can match." Victor felt his face burning with embarrassment as the full scope of his error became clear. He had approached an elite warrior, while that soldier was performing sacred duties, and had essentially ordered him to abandon his post and protocol to satisfy Victor's ego. It was equivalent to walking into a mosque during prayer and demanding that the worshippers stop to acknowledge his presence. "Furthermore," Major Harrison said, his tone growing slightly sharper, "your attempt to pull rank on a British soldier while he was protecting the monarchy was not just inappropriate. It was potentially treasonous by British military law. The fact that Lance Corporal Williams responded with such restraint speaks to his exceptional professionalism, not any weakness on his part." The revelation that the Guard's measured response had actually been restraint rather than aggression left Victor feeling completely out of his depth. In his military experience, conflicts were resolved through direct confrontation and displays of superior force. The Queen's Guard operated under an entirely different paradigm, one where true strength was demonstrated through absolute self-control and unwavering dedication to duty. Major Harrison allowed the silence to stretch for a moment, ensuring that his words had fully registered before continuing. "The protocols governing the Queen's Guard date back over 3 centuries and have been refined through countless interactions with foreign dignitaries, heads of state, and military leaders. These soldiers maintain their positions despite weather, discomfort, and yes, attempts by visitors to distract or provoke them. Their commitment to duty is absolute." Victor finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I did not understand. In my military experience, soldiers communicate with other soldiers as equals. I meant no disrespect to British traditions." Even as he spoke the words, Victor realized how inadequate they were as an explanation for his behavior. "The issue," Major Harrison replied with surprising gentleness, "is that you assumed your military experience applied universally without taking the time to understand the context you were entering. The Queen's Guard represents something far older and more sacred than conventional military hierarchy. They are the living embodiment of British military tradition and the monarchy's connection to the armed forces." As Major Harrison explained the deeper significance of the Queen's Guard, Victor began to understand that he had witnessed something remarkable, rather than something weakness. The guard's absolute stillness was not the result of rigid training but of profound inner discipline. His instant readiness to respond to perceived threats demonstrated reflexes and situational awareness that Victor had rarely seen in his combat experience. Each member of the Queen's Guard volunteers for this duty, Major Harrison continued, knowing that they will spend months at a time performing tasks that receive no public recognition and often invite mockery from people who don't understand what they represent. They accept this because they view their role as the highest honor available to a British soldier. Victor thought about his own motivations for military service and realized how different they were from what Major Harrison was describing. Victor had been drawn to military life by the opportunity for adventure, recognition, and the chance to prove his superiority over other men. The Queen's Guard served for something far more selfless: the preservation of tradition and the protection of something greater than themselves. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door, followed by the entrance of a tall officer wearing the insignia of a lieutenant colonel. Major Harrison immediately stood at attention, prompting Victor to do the same, though he wasn't sure of the appropriate protocol for his situation. Major Harrison, I trust you're addressing the incident with our Russian colleague, the lieutenant colonel asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. Victor noticed immediately that this officer's bearing was different from any military leader he had encountered. There was an almost aristocratic quality to his presence that spoke to centuries of military tradition. Yes, sir. I was explaining the protocols and significance of the Queen's Guard to Sergeant Petrov, Major Harrison replied crisply. The lieutenant colonel turned his attention to Victor, studying him with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating men under pressure. Sergeant Petrov, I understand you have extensive combat experience with the Russian naval infantry. That is commendable service. However, I hope you now understand that different military traditions require different approaches and attitudes. Victor nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. The lieutenant colonel's presence seemed to fill the room, and Victor found himself feeling like a junior enlisted man again, rather than the seasoned veteran he had been an hour earlier. The soldier you encountered earlier will return to his duties, without this incident affecting his record in any way, the lieutenant colonel continued. He performed his role exactly as he was trained to do. However, I hope this experience has been educational for you regarding the depth and complexity of British military traditions. However, the message was clear. The incident was being treated as a learning opportunity rather than a diplomatic crisis, but only because of the professionalism shown by the British personnel involved. Victor realized that his behavior could have had far more serious consequences if the situation had been handled differently. After the lieutenant colonel departed, Major Harrison escorted Victor back to rejoin the rest of the delegation. The tour continued, but Victor's experience was fundamentally changed. Instead of looking for opportunities to demonstrate his superiority, he found himself observing and learning from everything he saw. The precision of the ceremonial movements, the attention to detail in every aspect of the palace's military security, and the quiet professionalism of every British soldier he encountered spoke to a level of institutional excellence that impressed him despite himself. When the delegation finally encountered the changing of the guard ceremony, Victor watched with new eyes. The intricate choreography that he had previously dismissed as meaningless pageantry now appeared as the visible expression of centuries of military evolution and refinement. Every movement had purpose, every command had historical significance, and every participating soldier embodied the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of British warriors. The returning delegation members discussed the day's events during the bus ride back to the base, but Victor remained largely silent. Several soldiers attempted to include him in conversations, but he found himself reluctant to offer opinions or comparisons, as he had done throughout the week. The encounter with the Queen's Guard had fundamentally altered his perspective on military professionalism and the nature of true strength. That evening, Victor sought out Lars, the Norwegian Special Forces operator, who had tried to warn him about approaching the guards inappropriately. He found Lars in the base library, reading a book about British military history. You tried to tell me, Victor said simply, taking a seat across from Lars. I should have listened to your advice about the palace visit. Lars looked up from his book and studied Victor's face carefully before responding. Many soldiers make the mistake of thinking all military cultures are the same. The British have traditions that go back further than most countries have existed. Their approach to soldiering is different, but not inferior. Victor nodded slowly, appreciating Lars's diplomatic way of making his point. I have spent my career believing that strength comes from dominating others and proving superiority. Today I met a soldier who demonstrated greater strength through absolute self-control and dedication to duty. I do not know how to process this experience. Maybe, Lars suggested gently. The lesson is that there are many different ways to be a professional soldier. The path that works in one military culture might not apply in another. The important thing is recognizing excellence when you encounter it, even if it doesn't match your expectations. Victor spent the rest of his time in Britain observing rather than trying to impress. He attended the remaining training exercises with a new attitude, focusing on learning from techniques that differed from his own experience rather than criticizing them. The British soldiers began to warm to this changed version of Victor, sharing insights about their training methods and tactical approaches that they had been reluctant to discuss before. On the final day of the exchange program, Victor made one last visit to Buckingham Palace as a tourist rather than an official visitor. He stood among the crowds watching the changing of the guard, seeing the ceremony now as an expression of something profound rather than merely decorative. When the guards marched past in their precise formation, Victor found himself standing at attention in respect for their dedication and discipline. The flight back to Russia gave Victor time to reflect on everything he had experienced. He realized that his encounter with the Queen's Guard had taught him more about military professionalism than years of combat experience. True strength, he now understood, was not about proving dominance over others but about mastering oneself in service of something greater. Victor returned to his unit in Russia as a changed soldier. His fellow Marines noticed the difference immediately. He was calmer, more thoughtful, and more interested in developing his subordinates than in showcasing his own capabilities. When asked about his experience in Britain, Victor would simply say that he had learned important lessons about military tradition and the many different ways to serve with honor. The story of his confrontation with the Queen's Guard became legendary among his unit, but not in the way Victor had once craved. Instead of being remembered as a demonstration of his toughness, it became a tale about humility, respect for tradition, and the importance of understanding before judging. Victor discovered that this type of reputation was far more valuable than any he had built through displays of aggression or superiority. Years later, Victor would occasionally find himself thinking about Lance Corporal Williams and wondering about the man behind the motionless exterior. He had learned that true warriors often hide their greatest strengths behind quiet professionalism, and that the most impressive demonstrations of military capability sometimes involve doing nothing at all.